So welcome back, everybody, to the final of the masterclasses for the Inaction series. It's a real delight to round off the session with Mark and Zoe Enser. Now, I did see someone on Twitter saying that they thought the way we had put the sequence of masterclasses together was well designed, but actually it was just a total fluke. It was just about where people happened to be available. But actually, I do think it really does make sense as well. So the fact that the generative learning, it kind of feeds on, you know, so all the other ideas coming in, and there's a kind of overlapping going on, which I think is really, really fantastic. Now, Fiorella and Maya's generative learning in action. This is fantastic. I have to say, I wish I'd had this book years ago. It's so practical, so useful, and their framework is one where, a bit like Rosenshine's principles. I mean, I hadn't encountered it at all until very recently, really, in my whole sort of career. And when we were doing the Inaction series, seeing, you know, Mark and Zoe's different blog outputs, writing and TS articles and blogging, and I just thought, we want people who really know their craft in the classroom and who have written about these ideas to write this book. So it's an obvious choice to ask you to do it. And I think that's probably the record time for writing a book, from being asked to write it, really, from being asked to write it to writing it and it being published was just extraordinary. So you just really you just tore into it. So that's just sort of a preamble. I'm going to leave you to tell the story, and questions are coming through the chat. It's over to you, Mark and Zoe.
Thank you, Tom.
Thank you very much.
Should we go to the next one?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, if we can make this work. Sorry, technical glitch straight away. That's a good start, isn't it? Okay. Possibly one of my favourite words in education at all is the word context, and I think it's important that we always understand the context, whether we're talking about research, whether we're talking about experience. So just to give you a little bit of context about me and my kind of background, I first entered the classroom in '97. But that was as a teaching assistant. So I've kind of seen things from that perspective. Then spent 20 years teaching English. I was head of department, head of faculty, leading kind of media and film. And in my kind of final position in schools, I was working as part of the SLT, focusing on CPD and teaching and learning. And I'm currently now working as a lead English advisor for Kent with the education people. So I've got quite a range of experience. So when I kind of talk about things that I've done in the classroom or things that I've seen other people do in the classroom, it's very much from that perspective of inaction, as well as thinking about the research that underpins it. So I think that's kind of important. If you have got any further questions after the session, which is kind of inevitable as well, then do feel free to contact me either via Twitter, or I've put my email address at the bottom there, and I'm more than happy to do that. So as Tom said, you know, I write, I blog, and I really, really am excited about research. And generative learning, like for Tom, wasn't necessarily something that I was particularly familiar with at the time, but I kind of had come across it a few years ago, but have obviously spent a lot more time considering it. And again, it's interesting to see how it has already been working into context before I was necessarily familiar with the research.
Okay. So my name's Mark Enser. I've been teaching for 17 years and counting. I'm a head of geography and research lead at Heathfield Community College. I'm also a test columnist and author of many books. As Tom said, we did write Generative Learning in Action relatively quickly. We were asked to start writing it, I think, kind of in April, so kind of right in the midst of lockdown. We're kind of juggling writing this amongst kind of everything else that we were doing. I think the reason we were able to write it relatively quickly is that we were writing about our day job. You know, the things that we're going to talk about today, the things that we write about in the book, are things that we are putting into practice all of the time. You know, we have spent years doing this. So it's going to be quite a personal account today of kind of talking about the ideas behind generative learning, but we are going to focus very much on the inaction. So what have we actually done in the classroom with these ideas? So onwards.
Now, as Tom mentioned at the start there, the order I think was accidental, but I can remember kind of looking at it with a bit of a gulp and thinking, how on earth am I going to follow these people if we are the final kind of, well, I'm not saying anything against Mark, but if I'm the final person on that final day, how on earth am I going to follow it? But having seen and looked and thought about the presentations that have been put in place, actually it makes perfect sense and it fits really well with generative learning. Now, we talked about generative learning like it's something that people might be familiar with in terms of what that actually means. What it really is focusing on is how do students create meaning and what is it that allows them to have this deeper understanding of some of the concepts we're putting into place. And it therefore has quite a significant history and quite a lengthy history in relation to educational research generally. So it's got its roots all the way back into the idea of schema theory, with Piaget and Bartlett exploring that from both an educational and kind of psychology viewpoint. And it's really important when you're thinking about generative learning. One of the key principles is looking at where this new knowledge fits within the schema. There's a lot of research that suggests that actually, giving fragmented information to students which doesn't link to prior learning is a problem, and it's going to be really difficult for them to be able to remember and to learn. And so again, coming back to the work that Kate has done about retrieval, that's something that fits quite nicely amongst that as well. Also links to constructivism.
Yeah, so generative learning fits into a kind of very broad church of constructivism, and in particular cognitive constructivism, which really at its heart just suggests that people create meaning themselves in their own minds, that learning is largely an invisible process, and we all take information that might be the same, kind of the same information, but what comes out of that information is something very personal. So because it's attached to our schema and that web of existing knowledge, any new information is taken in light of that existing knowledge and seen through that lens. Constructivism can be quite a difficult idea. I think it can lead to some interesting practice, especially when it leads to a kind of a radical constructivist approach to teaching, which suggests that because everyone has a very individual take on any new information, we can't therefore teach, we can't then pass information on. Whereas what generative learning suggests is that we can, and that we can kind of instruct and we can give information. We just need to be aware that what a pupil does with that information will be personal to them and will be different from the pupil sat next to them.
So although the idea of generative learning kind of pre-existed the 1970s, it was really with the wonderfully named Merlin Whitrock that it was given a name and it was given a focus in the educational setting. And so he was exploring and researching the ideas which Mayer and Fiorella then continued to kind of examine through their lens to see actually what was it that meant that students were able to generate this understanding, to generate this meaning with the information that's around them. So kind of he was exploring that through the 70s and into the 80s, and he coined that phrase.
I think what's quite interesting is that we've got those ideas of schema theory, constructivism, and the ideas of Merlin Whitrock, which sit there in the kind of the 60s, 70s and before. By the time Fiorella and Mayer were writing about generative learning in this decade, of course, we'd already had Sweller's work on cognitive load theory entering kind of the educational discourse from the 80s, 90s and beyond. And one thing that's really useful is that understanding of cognitive load theory alongside generative learning. Both use a very similar model of learning. Both use a kind of multi-store model of sensory memory, working memory, long-term memory. Both involve the idea of retrieving information from the schema and then kind of assimilating new information into it and so on. So actually, it uses the same language, or at least it does now. And that can be very useful when it comes to thinking about it and discussing it with members of staff.
When I was really delving into it, though, as well, it was this idea of the what came next. So looking at the Rosenshine, which we know that Tom has already spoken about in great detail and how that works. Mayer and Fiorella did the same kind of process in that they were looking at what was working for teachers. And again, going back to kind of Whitrock's research, it was what was actually working for teachers to create this meaning. So with Rosenshine, we've got these wonderful steps which say, as instructors, what can we do to create the best bets for students to learn? Barrett Rosenshine looked and he explored and saw what it was that the best instructors, however we frame that, the best instructors were doing for their students in order to make sure that meaningful learning was happening. But for me, it is the what comes next. And this is where this idea of the flip side of Rosenshine comes in. This is what we do as teachers. As teachers, we model, we provide scaffolds, we ask those questions, we check for, understanding and success. But what do the students do amongst that? And what is visible and what is invisible to us? And some of the generative learning processes actually start to make this idea much more visible. So we can start to see what's going on in terms of their thinking. We can start to layer up meaning and make connections and patterns for those students to help them to really retain that.
All right. So we're thinking about what comes next. So we know we kind of have Rosenshine's principles, which tells us how to instruct. So then what do pupils do? And we can look at the SOI model here to give us some kind of guidance, which involves pupils selecting, organizing, and integrating information. And generative learning is all based around this model. So what this suggests is that we have a constant input of information. We're being assailed with new information all of the time, which is coming into our sensory memory. So where I'm sat now, I can see obviously the screen in front of me, but I can see the rest of the living room. I can see the view out of the window. I'm aware of a dog barking. I'm kind of, got all of this sensory information coming in, but actually there's a filter in place, which is my attention. And the first step in thinking about generative learning is really thinking about how we manage that attention so that we know what pupils are selecting. What information from all of the possible information are they thinking about? Which links us nicely to Daniel Willingham's memory is the residue of thought. Whatever we think about, that's what we're going to remember and what we're going to learn. So generative learning starts by people selecting information. They then organize that information in their working memory. So we know that working memory is very limited. It can't hold that much within it. And we also need space within our working memory to organize those things, to form them into sentences, to create an idea, to turn them into something. So that's our next step. When we generate learning, we organize information into a new form. We then integrate it into our long-term memory. So we think about it, we then try to connect it to what we already know. And this helps to create meaningful learning. If we think about Karpik and Grimaldi's definition of meaningful learning, that it's information that can be applied to new situations. If you can't integrate this new idea into what you already know, if you can't then take it out, retrieve it and apply it to something else, we haven't really learned it. It doesn't mean anything. It's that ability to use it in new ways that makes it meaningful. And that's what generative learning is really about. So it's that input of new information, which we then select, we organize it into some kind of new form, and we integrate it into our long-term memory. So the benefits of generative learning, the reason we want to think about learning in this way are many. It's why we wrote a whole book about it. So the first is really ensuring that learning sticks. One thing it helps us to do is to move away just from a culture of doing, that somehow what we need is lots and lots of activity, and instead starts us thinking about how do we make sure that pupils haven't just done the work, but they've learned it, that they can now do something new with it as a result of that.
Now, with the metacognition and motivation, something that the Fiorello and Mayer call the mighty M's, that's the it's the ultimate, isn't it? It's what we want for our students who are able to use those metacognitive processes and are really well motivated. And we know that a lot of what we do is to really struggle to try to engage them, to get them motivated, to get them wanting to do these things. What's really interesting in terms of generative learning is it makes some of those processes very visible. So that in itself is motivational, that students can actually see what it is that they're learning. They can see what it is that they need to go back over, and they can see the progress that they're making. And that is really motivational, and it allows them to regulate themselves and make some choices and have that ownership over their work, which starts to lead them towards becoming much more independent. And as we go through, we'll show you how some of the different strategies have these particular elements in our experience standing out especially.
Yeah, so that role of independence is really, really important. And it is a process. It's how we're getting there at the end. When we were writing this book, as I say, it was during lockdown. And one thing that I really noticed was how I was relying on generative strategies to help my pupils work remotely from home. And so we'll see in a moment, there's kind of 8 different generative learning strategies that can be deployed. And I was thinking about how I would use those to help pupils learn without me being present in the room all of the time. So it doesn't replace the instruction, but as we've said, it answers that question of what happens next. What do pupils do with the information they've received? The other reason it's really useful is that it provides very, very effective revision methods. So when we see the 8 different strategies, some of them you'll recognize, I would have thought, as ones you will already use with your classes as revision techniques. And this just ensures that they're being done very, very well. Because we use them in class as generative learning strategies, pupils are aware of their pitfalls, they know how to use them properly, and they can then select the correct strategies to use themselves at home. So the 8 strategies.
Okay, well, we'll just give people a moment to read through these. I would say on looking at them, my first response was perhaps a response that many people have had, which is, oh, yeah, these are things we do. And absolutely, it's coming back to that idea that we get with Rosenshine as well. This is what good instructors do. They use these strategies, they employ these tools in their kind of teaching toolkit, and they really think about using them. So I'm sure you will have used many of these over your time in the classroom and may well be developing them within your teams. What I think is interesting is exactly how we're using these strategies. And that's what we'll start to unpick a little bit in terms of our own practice as well.
Absolutely. I think it's worth just kind of pointing out that there are many other strategies that could be generative. These were the ones that Fiorella and Mayer really identified in the research as being especially effective and had kind of the strongest evidence base behind to use in a generative way.
Yeah, coming back to that idea of the best bets there, isn't it? Now, summarising is an interesting one for me because it immediately it feels so familiar. As an English teacher, I'd use summarising many, many times over the years, and it would perhaps come at the end of a learning sequence or at the end of a chapter. I would ask students to summarise or summarise their thinking about a particular topic, maybe at the start. And so I kind of looked at it and you think, yeah, actually, I do summarising. However, as we will find with all of these strategies, really, you can do summarising, but not in a generative way. And so that was something I really had to reflect on, the purpose of what I was doing. For summarising to be really effective, it needs to do those processes that were laid out in the SOI model by Mayer. So it has to encourage students to select the correct information, to organise that information into a new coherent kind of paragraph so they can see exactly what that looks like, and then integrate it into their longer term memory so they'll be able to use that information later and to be able to draw it and use it in that kind of agile way that Mark was talking about earlier. So when I reflect back to me in the classroom using summarising, it hadn't always been done as a generative activity. It appears on it's one of the AOs on the English language paper. It's on paper 2 with AQA, and students are asked to summarise key ideas from 2 different articles. There's a lot of synthesis involved there, so they are selecting information across. A good summary would be, aimed to organise, but that's kind of the end game really for them. It's not being done as part of their learning process. And so I had to step back a little bit and think about how I'd been using that. Another way I would use it, as I said, was perhaps at the end of the chapter. So we'd read something and then they would summarise it. But often there'd been a bit of an overload of information. I hadn't necessarily thought about the kind of the cognitive processes they'd gone through with all of that information. And so I would get students writing these reams and reams, particularly, I had one group one year, really, really eager group of girls. And I would ask them to summarise a chapter and they would practically write War and Peace back and hand that in for me. And that wasn't really selecting. They weren't selecting that information carefully. They weren't organising it carefully. The other side of that, of course, in terms of barriers to being able to do this well, is that students who have got literacy issues, and so their temptation may be to copy chunks of the information, especially if the information is still in front of them, write it down, get it verbatim. And again, they're not going through that generative process. They're over relying on other things. If there are literacy issues, that has a whole other barrier as well, because most of their working memory might be concerned with making sure that they can form letters, write sentences, and those kinds of processes, as opposed to really thinking hard and deeply about the information that's been given to them. So I had to kind of think again about my approach to this and what I'd been doing. And most importantly was the fact that I needed to teach them that process. If I wanted to use summarising in a generative way, I needed to go through that process with them. I needed to model that process for them and make sure that they were doing that well. I needed to make sure as well that they had the opportunity to check that quite quickly. So we weren't, again, embedding misconceptions, and we weren't finding that there were kind of issues arising with the information they had selected because they'd either over-relied on the materials, copying out things, or had not really selected but used everything that was available to them. So you use this in a particular way, don't you, with yours?
Yeah. So if we look at kind of an example then of how we might share this with our pupils, this is essentially what we do. This is what I run through with my pupils to teach them how to summarize properly. So we might have a piece of text. So in this case, it's a section of information about volcanoes in Japan. And if pupils were to summarize, they just end up kind of noting down the information that their eyes are first drawn to. So this is the information created within that kind of text. I'm just going to draw it out, and that's my summary done. But as we need to explain to them, this might not be an effective way to summarize. So they might be writing too much, as Zoe says, just copying too much out. A particular problem is having no particular focus. There's no selection. What am I summarizing for? What's the aim? What do I want from this piece of information? And then doing nothing with the summary. So just summarizing, and then what? What comes next? So what we need is the select, organize, and integrate model. So the way that might look with this is something like this. So first we need to select. So what is it about Japan's volcanoes that I need to know? So, well, actually, this piece of text, if I read through it, is actually about how tectonics affect Japan. So that's what I'm trying to summarize for. I then want to organize that information into a logical structure. So, well, is where 4 plates meet. Well, that's a destructive boundary. And then what happens next? Well, there's earthquakes and there are trenches. There's now kind of a story, a narrative running through. There's a reason for that information being organized in that form. And then I can think about integration. How does that link with what I already know about tectonics? So one of the points I might summarize is that subduction causes earthquakes. Well, the text doesn't say why that is, but I know why that is. It's because the rocks are breaking, releasing seismic energy. So I can add that into my summary. I'm integrating this with what I already know about the topic. So I'm using that same model, select, organize, integrate, to do an effective summary that helps me to generate learning. I now understand that better than I otherwise would. I've now learned it. I can apply it to new situations. So another example of how we might use it?
Yes, Cornell Notes, a very powerful way, I think, of actually bringing together lots of different elements of generative learning. But with Cornell Notes taking its name from the Cornell University in the States, that is a really simple system to help structure things for your students. So you'll see on there the page is divided in 3 ways. You have the main part of the page in the middle, which is for your notes and how you organise your notes. That can be entirely up to you. But again, it's back to making this thinking process quite visible. So students are starting to note down their ideas, note down what they think could be important based on the focus that you're giving them, and have got it there on their page, again, supporting their working memory. Down on the left-hand side, in a slightly larger margin, is a place where you put questions or key points. Questions can be really effective for retrieval. So if you're thinking about retrieval practice, that's one way that you can use it. Or just to highlight some of those key points, again, thinking about what they need to select and what's the most important information. Then at the bottom, you have a section for summary, and students will look at the information, or indeed even cover the information, so that they've kind of looked through, covered it over, and now are summarising, thinking really deeply about the information that they have been given there. So it's a structure where we can use those different elements and allow students to really summarise what the key points are using the information that they've been given. Again, it's really important to teach them how to do this, and so to take them through the processes, to model it for them, to model the thinking that goes alongside it as well, for it to be really metacognitive. That's going to be important. And you've got another example.
Well, yeah, so we use this quite a lot with our sixth form class in particular. We're starting to bring it down to GCSE as well. So what we might have are the pupils' notes. They're making their notes as normal, answering questions and so on throughout the lesson. That could be where they're actually drawing mind maps, diagrams, anything else, but that's just kind of their lesson work. We then ask them at the end of the lesson to put their key questions. So to think about what they've written and the notes that they've made, the questions they've answered, think, okay, what's the most important things that I should now be able to answer based on what I've learned this lesson? And then the summary, they write that evening. So without looking back at their notes, they try to summarize what they learnt. So we've got that little bit of retrieval in, having to think back to the lesson, having to review what they've learned all the time. When they come to revise, they've already got the key questions there to help them. So they can cover up their notes and they can try to answer the questions that are there.
Summary is something you can use with younger students as well. This isn't phase specific, but again, it's back to that teaching, and it's also being aware of any barriers that might be there. So you can ask students to summarise verbally. What you have to be aware of with that, of course, is the transient nature of it. And I know that Ollie was talking about the transient nature of kind of language earlier, and I imagine that Ollie Coviglione has also been speaking about that as well. But it's also the pressure that potentially could place on the working memory too. It can work, it can be effective, but again, you might want to think about whether that's the most effective way of doing things for that particular phase.
So our next generative strategy is one of my favourites. It's one that we use in geography a lot, and that's different forms of mapping. So concept maps, graphic organisers, way of taking information. And it's just kind of putting this back up here just as that constant reminder of what it is we're trying to do. When we're creating a mind map, we have to make sure that we're going through that process of select, organise and integrate. Otherwise, we end up with mind maps that simply aren't generative. And we end up, certainly, I've been using mind maps since I started teaching 17 years ago, and they now look very different than they used to. The mind maps people used to create were very colourful, lots of gel pens, glitter, bubble writing, but essentially they look like this, which is just writing things in a circle. There is nothing magical about putting a word in a bubble and then writing words around it. That doesn't help. That doesn't do anything. It doesn't engage the brain. There's nothing active there. That's just a bad summarization. So we have to teach pupils how to do mapping properly if we want them to use it. We have to talk about why we set things out in the way that we do. So to make mapping effective, what we should have is something that looks a bit more like this, which is where we have kind of categories for things. So, okay, I'm going to do a mind map on generative learning. So what are the categories of information that I want to talk about? I'm now having to select from everything I know about generative learning to come up with those headings. So I know it involves the SOI model. So I'm going to select anything to do with that. I know that it's rooted in a lot of educational history. So that's a category. I know there are boundary conditions. That's going to be another category. So I'm having to think quite deeply about the topic in order to set the mind map up in the first place. It's also helping me to organize my thoughts. So rather than just having everything written in a circle at random, whether it would fit on the page, I'm thinking, well, no, this is where that information belongs. This is part of the history. This is one of the boundary conditions. And this works really nicely as kind of something they do at the end of a topic when the information's been put away. So they're not just transferring information from place to place, they're trying to do this from memory and seeing what they can recall. The other thing we can start to do is integrate our prior knowledge onto the map. So you might have noticed we haven't mentioned Bjork at all in desirable difficulties, but actually somebody who's aware of kind of cognitive constructivism and is kind of thinking about the fact that, okay, we're putting the information away, we're trying to do this later on, will be aware that that is a desirable difficulty. We're making it a little bit harder for ourselves to do this, but in the hope of getting some kind of long-term gain. So Bjork's desirable difficulty belongs on the mind map. So I'm having to think about what's in my long-term memory, what's in my schema connected to this that I can also add to the map. So we map out all the information about a topic, and then we say, okay, what else is there? What else do I know that maybe I could add on from another source? But pupils won't do this naturally. If we leave them to it, mind maps look like that. We really have to kind of take them through it step by step. So I always start by modeling and by saying, okay, we're going to do a mind map, and maybe giving them the categories to start off with, and then getting them to fill it in. And then maybe the next time saying, okay, so we're going to do a mind map again on another topic. What categories should we use? Look back at your last mind map. What did we use for that one? Which ones would work for this? What other categories do we need? What do we mean by a category? And it just kind of helps them to go through the process. And this was one that I used a lot during remote learning. And it was one that I could use during remote learning because I taught them how to do it effectively already. I taught them how to use mapping. So when I said to them, do a mind map on this topic, they knew what that meant. It was much, much easier to do.
It works really well in English around the themes of a text as well. So as you continue and read and learn more about it, you can keep layering up that information. And the idea of them going back and forth in their learning and really embedding that information in their longer term memory, and maybe, as we do with our schemas, changing some of that information as the text develops, can be really powerful. And again, it's visible, they can see it, and that makes it motivational. They can see where those gaps are, they can see what they can add, they can see what they can develop.
Yeah, so another one way that we can do this is to do things like using different coloured pens. So doing the mind mapping in one colour, and then if you have to then go to your notes, you then add that on in another colour, and you can see where you had to rely on your notes, where you didn't. If you tried again in the future, can you do more without using your notes? So yeah, a really, really powerful strategy.
But not just highlighting.
Not just highlighting, no. So our next strategy is using drawing as a kind of a generative strategy. And again, as with so many of these, it is something that I've been doing in geography since I started teaching, is getting pupils to draw. You know, we like our colouring pencils. So we use drawing. We're getting pupils to draw things, but it hasn't always been generative. Yeah, in the past, we'd kind of say, okay, we want them to draw something, but the focus has often been on them creating kind of a beautiful drawing, a work of art, a picture, rather than thinking about the purpose of the drawing and making sure that comes to the fore. So a way that we might use drawing would be, again, we give them a text, and then we say, okay, read that, and then I want you to draw what that text describes. And in order to do that, pupils have to think really carefully about what that information actually says, because they're having to change the form. So in terms of their kind of what's happening internally, they're having to really reorganize those thoughts in a new way. They can't just transfer it from place to place. They can't just copy that text somewhere else, or even just select the correct answer to a question from the text and copy it somewhere else. They're having to change the forms. They have to really understand it. So in this case, if we said, you know, read that information and draw it, they should get something that looks a bit like this. That's what that text is showing. So it forces them to think hard about the information. Now, there can be a few barriers to using drawing. One of them is that pupils can fixate on the fact that they can't draw very well, that their picture won't look like it's supposed to. Well, you know, what they're picturing in their head isn't going to appear on the page, and they can find that quite difficult to overcome. One way we can help them with this is through modeling. I'm terrible at drawing anything, and they soon see, you know, if I say, I want you to draw a diagram, and, you know, this is what it could look like, here's an example of a kind of another diagram, I can explain to them that the point isn't this kind of beautiful work of art, it's to learn the information, and that they never have to look at the picture again, that the picture itself isn't important, it's the process of drawing it that matters. You know, if they do it on a scrap piece of paper and throw it away, it doesn't actually matter. It was going through the process of thinking, how do I show this? And so you can do it for kind of things like this, which the way that we've often used drawing, which is to show a process, to draw a diagram that shows a process, but you can use it for anything else. You can draw out, so if an example, we used recently, we were looking at gentrification of Brick Lane and saying, okay, how can I draw the gentrification of Brick Lane? Now, I don't want them to draw a picture of what Brick Lane looks like. I want them to draw images that help to symbolize what's changing, that the flows of migrants coming in. I want them to draw symbols of newfound affluence. I want them to draw how that's forced other people out. So they kind of, series of arrows and little symbols for money and things that people are now buying there, because they're having to think hard about the information in order to do it.
And I think this point about the symbols, that can be really powerful. I've been quite critical, I suppose, of drawing as a technique in the past, despite having spent a lot of time with students drawing the opening of Mice and Men or drawing the characters in different texts, which, I can see there is a value there if they are really having to think carefully and select it. But often we'd hit that barrier of the technical accuracy. That doesn't look like, Lenny on the page, or that doesn't actually look like the mountains in the background. But that isn't what's important. And so I think it has even more power when you're talking about things like imagery in language and getting them to create symbols that explore that imagery and maybe explore that narrative, as opposed to just an episodic memory of when we looked at that particular text, I drew a picture and that's what it all becomes about. So it's again back to this point of purpose. How are we using it? Why are we using it? And are we using it in a generative way? Or are we using it for something else, which you may well have a perfectly valid rationale for that. But if we're using it generatively, we need to really think about how we're putting that together for them.
So our next strategy is self-testing.
Okay, and this is absolutely my favourite one, without a doubt, and something that I've used loads and loads and loads, and I definitely know that many of you out there will have been doing that, because it kind of links in with the idea of kind of retrieval practice, space practice, and interleaving. And I've got the lovely diagram there, the Ebbinghaus, which is, this is all kind of rooted in. So as we know with self-testing, it's really giving those students the opportunity to explore what they've retained, how long they've retained it for, how deep that learning is. And if we come back to that point about that's what generative learning is about, it's about creating that meaning and about that deeper understanding that we want students to have. And self-testing can work really, really well for this. I think it's particularly powerful in terms of metacognition and self-regulation as well, because again, it's really visible. If you do a test and then do the same test a few weeks later, then you can see if progress has been made and if progress hasn't been made. You can see where there may be kind of issues with things that haven't stuck and explore how to do that. So retrieving things from memory is really, really powerful, we know, for students. And there's a kind of a huge research base that underlies that. And the Karpik and Grimaldi, with their retrieval-based learning, again, gives us another perspective of how the testing effect is actually a learning process. It's not learning about rote. It's not just retrieving information that you're going to use in a pub quiz. It is about making sure that significant learning can really happen. Some of the things that I've had to overcome in my practice with it is making sure students actually were retrieving from memory, because that's where the magic happens. That's where it's so important, because you're kind of really pulling that information out of your long-term memory and you're bringing it to the fore, and then you're using it again, and ideally then relating that to new information as that comes in. So getting students to actually be comfortable with doing that can be tricky, because it's hard. Thinking is hard and learning is difficult, and so I've had quite a few students where I've had to do a lot of convincing that they aren't going to look at their notes, they aren't going to look back through, and indeed that they're not going to kind of just decide, well, I can't do question one, so that's it, I'm going to give up with that. So I've had to do quite a lot of work in relation to that. It brings me back to Carol Dweck's book on growth mindset as well, which I know that there's been a lot of criticism in terms of the research and whether it can be replicated. But one part of that kind of really flagged this idea about student self-regulation as well, and whether students were able to spend that time going back to the things that had been difficult. And this again is a bit of a barrier, it can be, with self-testing, because students will automatically want to focus on things that will give them a quick win. So they will ask themselves questions or self-test in areas which they're most comfortable with. And you see it all the time when they get a revision guide, and particularly if you've got them outside of the subject area and they get their science revision book out, and they immediately turn to the page of the thing they did last, or they immediately turn to the page of the thing that they're most comfortable with. And you really have to push them outside of their comfort zone a little in order to be able to get that to work. And again, with the space practice, don't just rely on what it was you did the lesson before or the week before, making sure that they're properly spacing that and interleaving with your curriculum. I think we've got, as practitioners, very good at organising some of the learning for them around that and making sure that they've got the space and the interleaving taking place with their retrieval. But they still need those kind of scaffolds and supports for us. We need to make sure they're asking the right questions as well when they're self-testing, not just the right topic, but the right questions. And sometimes then rewording those questions again to really force the learning to take place and to force them to bring out information from different areas in relation to the kind of main topic.
We did a study recently with the Institute for Effective Education that we referred to briefly in the book as one of the case studies on self-testing. And we were really interested in whether starting a lesson with low-stake quizzing made a difference in Key Stage 3 history and geography, because we knew from the research that Zoe was talking about that retrieval practice should work and pupils testing themselves should work. But there weren't really studies in our subjects. There was lots on maths and science, lots on psychology undergraduates, the most studied people of all time, but nothing really on 12-year-old geography students. So we wanted to see if it had an impact. And the findings were really interesting in terms of generative learning, because what we discovered is they were having a fairly big impact in geography, but they were having almost no impact in history. And we were trying to kind of unpick why that might have been the case. And one thing that we noticed was the questions we were asking in geography were very different to the kind they were asking in history. In history, they were asking questions like, what was the date of? What was the date of the Battle of Hastings? When did World War I finish? Questions like that. Who said this? Who was the first? Which just involved them recalling one piece of information. When we looked at the geography questions, we were asking questions that were a little bit deeper. And it wasn't particularly intentional. That's just how we asked questions. So we were saying things like, why is it hotter on the equator? Well, to answer that question, pupils have to put various bits of information together. They have to select and organize and integrate. They were naturally generative questions. They were that little bit deeper and more involved. And that had seemed to have an impact. There were very few other differences between geography and history other than the nature of the questions that we were asking. And so I think perhaps that's something that we need to think about as teachers is, as Zoe said, we got very good at starting lessons with quizzing and encouraging self-testing in our pupils and of retrieving from memory, of using space practice, of interleaving different topics. Maybe that's the next step, is thinking, are the questions generative in nature? Because that could be very important. It doesn't mean all questions have to be, because as we said, there's different purposes for doing things, but if we want them to generate learning, we want them to think deeply about the information we've presented, that might be important. Okay, so our next strategy, imagining. So using our imagination. Now, I first came across generative learning a couple of years ago when Tom Sherrington and Oliver Caviglioli were sharing on Twitter, and I had a look at it, and a lot of it, I was kind of nodding, yes, summarizing, good, I do that, mapping, oh, that's actually, yes, I do that. I could see how I might do it differently based on what I was reading. And I came to imagining, I went, no, I'm not doing this. But I do. And I do imagining a lot. I just wasn't particularly thinking about it in those terms. There was something about it that just made me think, oh, role play. That's what imagining is. Let's all imagine, and we used to do it in geography in the past. Let's imagine that we're experts in plate tectonics. Ask them a question about it. And because they didn't know anything about plate tectonics, the answers were rubbish. Or imagine you're a news broadcaster and you're giving the news on the latest earthquake. They didn't know anything to present. They spent ages just kind of running around pretending to be news broadcasters making microphones. But imagining as a generative activity is really important. It's based on knowledge. If you want pupils to imagine something, they have to know something about it first. So the way imagining might work is I want you to imagine that you have been in this earthquake. So I'm going to describe a scene of an earthquake, and then I want to pause and for you to imagine that you were there. What do you see? What do you hear? What's going on around you? The reason we do that is it helps to support comprehension. We want them to understand what they've read or what they've heard, so we want them to think deeply about it. So what was it like to be there when Typhoon Haiyan was coming in? You know, what would you see, experience, hear? Can you put all those bits of information together you've been given into a coherent whole that allows you to imagine it? So that's what we're asking them to do. We're saying stop and imagine. We use it whenever we ask them to make a prediction. So we use it in geography all the time, whether we call it imagining or not. So we might say to them to take what they've learned about climate change, take what they've learned about a particular part of the world, say North Africa, and now predict what the impact of climate change will be on that region. Well, that's imagining. They're having to imagine what the impact would be based on what they know. And so that's what we're really asking them to do. I know in English you use it a fair bit.
We use it an awful lot, certainly in terms of making predictions. But if I was teaching Macbeth, then we would obviously look at his behaviour, look at the descriptions of him early on in the play, make some predictions going forward, pause, make predictions again. I've also used it with teaching, and again, it was only when I sort of stopped and paused and thought about, you know, how do I use imagining that I realised this. But when I was teaching things like an inspector calls, I would always begin the process by setting the scene and really helping them to imagine and use some images of the world in 1912, the world in 1945, so they could imagine the world of the characters and the world of the author, the playwright, so they could really get an idea of how that works. And I think that's something with Tim Taylor, who kind of he does an awful lot of work around the mantle of the expert, and he wrote the case study for this. That was something that he really draws on in terms of that. I think the point about the base on knowledge is very true for all of these strategies. We can't ask students to summarize unless they've got something to summarize, so that they've got to have that knowledge base. We can't test them on knowledge that they haven't got. It all becomes a bit pointless. So making sure they've got that strong knowledge base, but in some of these strategies, you need it much more than others. So it's, you know, that's one of the things that we'll come back to and explore in a bit more detail. But the phase of their learning as well as the phase of the learner is going to be really important in relation to that.
Absolutely. I think we can kind of see imagining alongside drawing, kind of a technique that we were describing earlier. And in some ways, imagining gets around some of the barrier conditions with drawing. You can ask people to imagine something. They then don't have to go through the process of going, well, I don't know how to draw this, and that's going to be a problem for me. Or imagine the scene, imagine what this text looks like. The problem can be that there's a strong element of trust, because there's nothing produced at the end of it. You don't know whether they've imagined it correctly or successfully, or if they've even gone through the process of imagining it. Have they just sat there with their eyes closed for 2 minutes, thinking about what they're going to do when they go home? So that's a different barrier condition. So it gets over some of the issues around drawing, but it creates new issues that we might just have to consider.
And it can also potentially place extra load on that working memory. So if they're thinking about something else, but also trying to imagine, for some students, they're really going to struggle with that as well.
Yeah. So our next strategy is self-explaining. And this is something that, again, we ask pupils to do a lot. A lot of questions that we ask pupils to do are essentially self-explaining. Now, answer this question is kind of usually explain why something is the case. The idea of using self-explaining as a strategy is it's something they can take away and they can do themselves. So you've given an answer. So let's think of an example. So why did Boscastle flood? So maybe that's kind of, you know, they've got this question, why did Boscastle flood? And they go, oh, well, it flooded because there was really heavy rain and steep valley sides, and that caused the river to flood. Okay. But we now want them to explain that to themselves, to kind of really unpick it, to go into it in more detail. So they have to select, organize, and integrate. They have to think, okay, what else do I know about this topic that I'm going to add in to my fairly basic, fundamental, rudimentary answer, heavy rain and steep valley sides? A way that we can do this is by teaching them how to use Socratic questioning and to use these kind of Socratic question stems with them in class, and to encourage them to do it at home themselves when they're revising or engaging in some kind of independent study. So this might involve things like classify your thinking. So what do you already know about the topic? So if we were doing, why did Boscastle flood? Well, what do you know? Take a moment to go through everything that you know about the Boscastle flood and really draw it out. So that was our first step, where we got to, well, there was heavy rain and steep valley sides. That's why the flood happened. We then say, well, okay, so the next step is to probe assumptions. What additional evidence would lead to you reaching some kind of different answer? This can help to flag up things that maybe they don't know, where they've got gaps in their knowledge. So, well, if I knew that there was some kind of human cause to the flood, then that would change my answer. If I knew that actually it was due to building design, or if they'd done some channel straightening, or then that would lead to me reaching a different conclusion. Maybe I need to go and find out if that was the case, because I don't know. So we kind of probe where their assumptions are, and then we demand evidence. So what evidence have you got that it was heavy rain and steep valley sides? You know, do you know how much rainfall fell? Do you know that it was more rainfall than would usually fall? How steep were the valley sides? How does that compare to neighbouring areas where there wasn't a flood? So they have to then start thinking again in more detail, selecting more information, dragging it out of their schema, out of their long-term memory, and applying it to this new situation. Now, what would be your alternative viewpoints? Who would disagree? Would there be people in that community who would say, no, it wasn't a physical cause, it was a human cause, that's what led to it? And why would they have those different opinions? So they're really having to go into some depth now into these issues. What are the implications of your conclusion? If you say it was just a physical cause, well, then what does that mean? You know, what would have to change or happen as a result of you reaching that conclusion? Would people have to act in a different way in the future? Would that change the management strategy if we accepted that to be the case? And then finally, to actually get them to question the question. And this gets them into kind of disciplinary thinking. Why would a geographer bother to ask what caused the Boscastle flood? Why is that a useful or interesting question? Why do we care? And so going through these question stems about something that's a fairly kind of simple question, maybe they're revising it for a case study, it's just something we want them to know because we've decided it's important in our curriculum. This forces them to think about it in some depth and to make sure they can explain it to themselves fully. If we just say, explain it to yourself, then we go nowhere. They just kind of go, well, okay, Boscastle flood, heavy rain, whatever, I'm moving on with my life. By making them go through some kind of process that we can model, unpick, explain the importance of, we then give them a strategy they can really use. And that's when I think it becomes useful.
And again, with this process, it could be something which is layered up. So a bit like we saw with the mapping, where they kind of return to it, they can come back to these questions, they can challenge these questions again. And that is going to be particularly powerful for that longer term retention.
Absolutely. So our next strategy has got a couple of these left. So our next one is teaching, the idea of pupils teaching each other. And again, after imagining, getting to teaching, was a bit, no. Because it has badly backfired in the past. I remember when I started teaching in the kind of 2004, and we were often told that pupils should teach each other because it involves the teacher not having to talk, and teacher talk was a bad thing. And children learn better from each other. Never gave any evidence for that, which is kind of a thing. Children learn better from each other. They can explain it better than you can, which was a worrying kind of indictment of the teaching profession, wasn't it? Because we should be better at explaining it. But the research on teaching is relatively compelling. It's one of the weaker ones of generative learning, but there is still some very good research that teaching pupils helps you to learn something, that actually you learn from teaching.
Part of the problem with the research base there, as you say, you know, there's strong evidence for it working, but what was quite difficult was unpicking exactly what it was that was leading to that generative process and to seeing students having that kind of deeper learning. Because once you bring teaching in, you've got another dynamic. You've got not just the person who is explaining and teaching and going through that process, but you've then also got the audience, you've got the questions that may follow and that kind of interaction. And what was quite difficult in research in relation to this was stripping it out to just the teaching element. But there are a couple of different ways they attempted to do that.
Yeah, so if we look at what the teaching kind of really involves, that they found there's kind of three processes linked to the SOI model. So firstly, if pupils are going to have to teach something, they have that preparation stage. So if you say to your class, okay, next lesson, you're going to teach everyone else this, they have to start selecting carefully from the materials they've been given, thinking hard about what it is they want to say. It forces them to do that because they know there's going to be a consequence if they don't, which is clearly not knowing anything, which can be somewhat embarrassing. They then have to really actively engage with that material to put it all together. It's not enough, they know they can't simply read the material because maybe everyone's got that material. So they have to think, okay, what can I bring to this? How can I explain it in a different way? How can I link it to other things that I know? How can I integrate this information into my prior knowledge to put together something that's unique that I'm bringing to the class? And how can I make my explanation really clear? How can I organize my thoughts in a way that allows me to do that? And then finally, you get that kind of interaction between the child who's trying to teach the information and the rest of the class, who's asking them questions, who's almost going through that self-explaining process for them of saying, well, I don't understand. Could you explain that again? Could you go into that? And the pupil then has to think, well, actually, I can't. Maybe I've got a gap in my knowledge here, which I now has been revealed. I know I need to go away and fill. Or they can think, actually, I can answer that question. I can draw on that thing I hadn't even considered before and bring that into my teaching, much like we do in the classroom as teachers.
One of the ways that I use this in my own practice was related to kind of the poetry. You have 14 poems that students need to know really well. And it was very successful when I kind of ran the process in this way for ensuring that they'd really learned some of the poems deeply. And what I did was after an initial teaching, because I'm very keen to not allow students to embed misconceptions, which can happen with this teaching process. It's one of the kind of considerations they need to put in place, that students might just be teaching each other the not quite right information and embedding those misconceptions. So once I'd gone through the poems with them initially, they were then allocated different poems to look at and explore. The other side of that is if you were to just kind of Google AQA poetry, which was the example that I was using, you would come up with a huge list of presentations, some of which have been produced by other students, some of which is fantastic quality. That's been, there's books in relation to it, but making sure my students had access to the right materials was really important, to make sure that the knowledge that was going in was the good knowledge, that they could then think deeply about it. I also used it as a way to do the speaking and listening task as well. So I was kind of, I suppose, killing two birds with one stone. But what it did mean was that students had that opportunity to really focus in on their particular poem. They had that opportunity to be questioned in relation to it and to explore it, and their outcomes were good. And they certainly, it was something that they enjoyed and they felt they really understood. It was always wonderful when you saw a student picking tissue as their choice of poem, when you gave them a bit more free choice, because as you know, that there are many teachers who might not choose to teach that themselves, but their outcomes in terms of that were much greater than if I had done it, or perhaps approached that in a different way. So it's got a lot of potential, but it also has got a lot of boundaries that you need to be aware of. And I think for me, it's the misconceptions and the quality of the information in to make sure that actually the information coming out to the rest of the class is going to be of value too.
I think when we were writing Generative Learning in Action, we were always quite keen that the book wasn't a sales pitch for these strategies. We're always very aware that these things do have their boundary conditions and difficulties. And I think one thing that's really interesting with teaching, was you kind of mentioned earlier, self-explaining coming into teaching. And Zoe mentioned that it's quite hard sometimes to separate the different effects. And so when pupils are going through those first couple of stages of learning, generative learning through teaching, of kind of selecting information, putting their explanation together, they are generating learning through that. But the research did find that last important step was important. The actual act of teaching it to someone else, of being questioned, of having to present it, did make a difference to them. And that's what we need to remember when we're talking about this generative learning. It's the pupil doing the teaching that's learning, not the other 29 pupils in the class who may be picking up those misconceptions. And so it is a really difficult consideration to make. Is it worth going through this process of getting pupils to teach things? What's everyone else in the class doing? Was that one pupil is benefiting from teaching them? the others are benefiting less than if you had taught them yourself. So just organising it maybe into groups. So I think the example that Freya gives in the book, rather than having one pupil teaching the rest of the class, is kind of teaching a smaller group, so kind of in fours maybe, so everyone gets more opportunity to teach, could perhaps be more useful. And these kind of ideas of kind of boundary conditions and some of these difficulties really comes in with our final strategy, enacting. So enacting is really what it says on the tin, it's acting things out in some way. And it seems to be most beneficial, possibly in most cases only beneficial to very young children. So kind of foundation, early years, the first few years in Key Stage 1. And this is because pupils are still at what's called a pre-operational or egocentric stage. They really struggle to make the jump between their kind of concrete experience and abstract ideas. Everything feels kind of very strange and other unless it relates to them. So yeah, they're either like very young children or people on Twitter. It kind of has to be about them, or they've really got no understanding of what's going on. So enacting really does work with those very, very young children. And what it tends to involve is the use of models and gestures. So if you wanted to teach pupils a story and you wanted them to remember the story itself, you might need to act it out using little puppets or little models. So here's Red Riding Hood and she's going through the forest. So here's Red Riding Hood and here's the forest. You can now picture that happening because they may not be able to understand themselves quite what that means unless they have a model to show it. Okay, now you act it out. She's meeting her grandmother. So now let's do the little meeting of the little puppets and things. It could involve models in things like math, so using beads for counting, because numbers are very abstract ideas. What does 2 and 2 mean? Well, here's 2 and 2. Let's put them together. How many have you now got? It could involve gestures. The example that we have in the book is from a teacher called Tarjinder Gill, and she was trying to teach her Key Stage 1 class some quite complex things about ancient Egypt and the funeral rites and things, and trying to get them to use the correct term for the urns and objects. And she found it very difficult to remember the correct term for the right thing. And so she attached a gesture to the item. So whenever they said the item, they used a gesture and they started putting the two together and been able to discuss these items with more confidence. So it works well with those kind of much, much younger children. And it is about supporting that move from concrete to abstract thought. Where it doesn't tend to work is if there is no problem moving from the abstract to the concrete, or the concrete to the abstract. If you can do that, then these things just become a barrier. So getting GCSE pupils to enact Romeo and Juliet using models are probably going to lead to a situation where they actually just focus on the models and making them and acting them out, and not on the story of Romeo and Juliet. It becomes the thing they're thinking about instead. If we think about multi-store model of memory and that idea of sensory information coming in and what do we pay attention to, if you would pay attention only to the models, that's the thing that you remember. It can work with older children. I use it occasionally in geography for things like different processes of erosion. Pupils tend to confuse attrition and abrasion. And attrition is the knocking together of materials, abrasion is the rubbing. And so a little gesture that they do for attrition and abrasion can sometimes just help them to see the difference and then to think, okay, so what does that mean? Well, attrition's the reason that particles get smaller and more rounded because they're knocking edges off, and abrasion's the thing that rubs them smooth. So they start to grasp it somewhat better. But most cases, enacting really only applies to those younger children.
And I think it's something we do quite naturally with younger children, when we're kind of showing them various different things. It's part of our own modelling processes. We'll show them that particular gesture. You see it when young children are learning rhymes, learning the alphabet, where things that are abstract are made concrete in some way, and they're given that opportunity to act it out. Even kind of memories of things like vertical and horizontal, we know that we kind of will use that in order to outline it for them. But certainly I think acting out Romeo and Juliet with puppets at GCSE probably wouldn't go down too well.
No, we've moved on. We've come a long way. It does need a very, very careful approach. So boundary conditions. We've talked about a few already as we've gone through, but there's maybe a few general ones to consider.
Yes, yeah. In terms of the phase, we've talked about the age of the child, but I also think it's important to think about the phase in learning. If they haven't got that kind of knowledge, if they're not at that particular point with their own cognition, then some of these perhaps won't be the best bets for them. So you might need to kind of consider that. And when you're looking at kind of working with SEN pupils as well, thinking about how they are, or what phase they're at in their kind of processes in order to make those choices. We've talked a little bit about how it's different in different subjects, and again, you know, contextualizing, I said that was one of my favorite words, but contextualizing it for your subject is going to be really important, and thinking about, well, you know, what is this going to bring, what benefits is this going to bring to my particular subject area that's going to make the difference. We've mentioned as well that kind of knowledge base. It's so important that they've got the appropriate knowledge, because if they've got nothing in their schema to draw on, nothing to link to, we're working at a really kind of difficult kind of deficit really for them. And their level of expertise, we know there are key differences between the way a novice learns and the way an expert learns. And again, that brings us back to that point about phase. How much curriculum time are you going to devote to this as well? If you think it is really, really important to focus on mapping for your students, and you want to do that in a generative way, you need to devote time to showing them how to do that. You need to devote time to teaching them how to do it, modeling it, refining it, giving them time to practice that, to get it right, checking that they're getting it right. And it might be that you think, absolutely, you know, this is going to, you know, make things hugely different for my students. It's going to really benefit them. But equally, you might think, well, you know, what am I losing? So making those kind of decisions around curriculum time are important.
I mean, distractions, I think we've kind of mentioned, is just that some of the techniques can be distractions in themselves. And we just need to make sure that pupils are thinking about the thing we want them to think about. If they're having to think about the models, or they're having to think about the drawing, or they're having to think about, that's not ideal. We want them, these strategies ideally should become fluent things they can just do if we devote the time to teach them how to do it. They shouldn't be the thing that they're then having to think about.
And we'd never say, you know, here are 8 strategies of generative learning, off you go, and, you know, you're all going to do these next week. I think it's important to make those decisions, think about what's going to be beneficial. And if you are inclined to spend some time working on these, and I do think there are lots of benefits to them, how are you developing your staff to be able to really understand them, to understand the why that sits underneath it, to understand the kind of the model of the way that the mind is working, and give them that time to really develop their understanding, to be able to teach it well so that the students can use it effectively.
Absolutely. And so kind of our conclusions really is first of all, the kind of key thing for me with generative learning is that it answers the question, now what? Once you've instructed, once you've given information, once people have that information in hand, how do they turn that information into something they've learned? And this is the answer to that question. It's that SOI model through those strategies is what pupils do next. For that to work, we need to have selection, organisation, and integration. And actually, in terms of staff development, if we teach that idea, then a lot of this follows along behind it. So just thinking about those learning activities we do with our pupils, are they having to select, organise and integrate? If they're not, why not? You know, why can't they do that? Why can't they select, organise and integrate information? Because that seems to be the thing that leads to this meaningful learning. And then finally, absolutely critical, as we've just been saying, is that we have to consider that different methods work better with different ages and with different subjects. The thing that needs to happen now really is that people need to take this back to their departments, and for people to sit and say, okay, what does this look like in geography or English or history or science? And we've given some examples in the book based on people we've spoken to with case studies and examples, but people need to approach this as either phase specialists or subject specialists and think about how this works for them and how they want to approach it, because it can't just be kind of a bolt on, now we're going to go away and do it. But if we get it right, it is incredibly powerful and it makes a huge difference. So hopefully we have some time for questions. So I can see that kind of a few little bits in the chat there. So if there's anything else that you would like to add, that'd be wonderful. And I think we have Tom popping up there ready to go.
Right. Well, honestly, first of all, just want to say massive congratulations to you for a superb masterclass. I've just been captivated. I've been sort of tweeting about it and so on. It's fantastic, and it's great hearing you talk about it in that kind of extended way. In fact, this is one of the reasons I like the masterclasses format, because you're going to have time to lay it all out. And it's just so clear to me now. So I've read the book, but even now I feel like the SOI aspect of it is really like crystal clear. It's a kind of you've got these 8 strategies, which are, like you've said, a subset of what could be more, but each one has this constant thread: select, organize, integrate. And I'm thinking, the integration aspect could be challenging, that the selection is sometimes people are given that on a plate. And there's so many different things that you've talked in there. And I love the fact that you have this 2 different, slightly contrasting subject backgrounds, which allow you to kind of bring the ideas alive in a varied way. Wow. Really
that for me is really what matters, isn't it? Research is fantastic. I love reading research, but it's what we go away and do with that research that makes a difference. And that's why it was so fantastic that you asked us to explore this, and you've got the rest of the series exploring it too.
Yeah, and I think that what you did there, so a couple of things that I liked. For example, when you said about imagining, Mark, you were saying that, when you first saw that, you thought, yeah, I don't really get it. But actually, and that combined with the boundary conditions, you're thinking, okay, I mean, it's not going to sort of change my life because it's got limits, but actually I can see a value in it to this limit, and that's something I can then use. And that's the subtlety that we need in this kind of debate and exposition. We need to be sort of saying, we're not selling ideas to you. we're explaining possibilities, and then you have to kind of sort of see how that fits and that contextualization. So very, very interesting. I've got some questions in my head, but I'm just going to go to the chat here. So to be honest with you, so far most people are just saying, that they liked it and so on. But people now, there's your time. Getting the questions going is sometimes take a bit of time. But self-explaining, what's the difference between teaching and self-explaining?
Really, it comes down to the putting it into practice.
Yeah.
As we were saying, one of the issues with teaching and the research around pupils teaching each other is that separating out the bit that's just them self-explaining and the bit where they actually then put it into action to teach someone else is difficult. But it does seem to have an impact. So essentially what's happening is when they're going through the process of getting ready to teach, they're using a self-explaining generative learning strategy, but then they have to deliver it to other people. It could be that adds an extra layer of motivation. The fact you're going to have to do that means you take the self-explaining beforehand more seriously, because there's a consequence if you don't. And then the interaction that you then have with the people you've tried to teach might make it a more powerful strategy. So essentially it is self-explaining up to the point that you then put it into practice.
But they did actually, in the research, they tried to sort of strip that out and say, well, okay, so what happens if we say you're going to be doing teaching, but then take the audience away? And they saw that there was actually a drop in kind of the outcome. So it really is having that audience. And I think as well, those kind of probing questions, students can probe themselves to an extent with the self-explaining, even with those kind of question stems that you give them. But then when something new arrives and when you ask that kind of challenging question, then that helps them to form that schema or kind of reorganize their schema in relation to that.
I think that's interesting, because I was talking about that earlier in the beginning of my talk, talking about daily review, weekly, monthly review. There's a sort of commitment aspect. And it's one of the reasons why, I don't want to go off track here, but I'm quite a fan of exams, because I do think that there is a benefit in the kind of the performance aspect of really making you go that far to really properly learn and understand it and really know it, rather than allowing yourself to kind of defer it to perhaps a bit later. So I guess having to actually explain it is slightly different from just kind of thinking, well, I kind of know it, and you just go that bit further.
And that's the thing, and it's the same with the retrieval as well. And one of the things I ask students to do is to write down their answers with that, because you can trick yourself, can't you? And with self-explaining, you can do that, and retrieval, you can do it. You go, I know something like it, or I'm vaguely, it's familiar, but that doesn't necessarily mean you actually know that thing.
I think there are some logistical things about getting lots of students doing. I've seen it done well in, say, maths classes, where students are given a problem to explain to the class, and they're teed up for the following lesson. So the students come in and present a problem, but you don't sit there listening to sort of 15 of them. It's just that students go. and so they're getting the experience. And some of those logistical things do sort of impede the kind of that becoming an embedded part of someone's practice, I guess. But certainly more able, or older students definitely find that more fluent, and you have less sort of practice aspects to it, and so on. Anyway, I mean, that's just sort of giving my perspective. Here's a question: is there a list of question prompts for the Socrative? I guess get the pronunciation right. Socrative questioning.
It's in the book. I mean, there's the kind of 6 question stems that I went through are the ones that I tend to come across about probing assumptions and things. So I think they're in the self-explaining chapter. It talks about kind of Socratic questioning. If not, have a look for Socratic questioning, question stems, and they're there.
So yeah, I can see that they're in there. Sort of classify the thinking, probe assumptions, demand evidence, alternative viewpoints. Yeah, so that's really interesting. So that's all in the book. You got to leave people wanting to go and go there. So this is largely about retained knowledge, but can you imagine it being useful for subjects with a large skills focus, such as art and music? So that's interesting. I mean, obviously, you're talking about your perspectives, but how does this sort of stuff link to creative subjects, performance-orientated subjects?
Well, I think for a start, there is definitely quite a large knowledge base with those subjects as well. So I'd be using some of those things with my students as well to make sure that they knew the choices that they could make. Obviously, you've then got the practice element and the practical element that they're going to keep going over and keep exploring. But, in order to do well in music, in order to do well in art, they really need to have those kind of base understanding of what's required of them, as well as that kind of practice time. So I'd be using it there.
Yeah, I don't think it applies just to the kind of practice to fluency. So things like, I was talking about kind of MFL, art, music. It applies to anything where you need to create new understanding. That's what generative learning is. It is creating a new understanding from information. If you're not trying to create new understanding from the information, then you don't need generative learning, because you're not trying to generate learning. You're practicing to fluency. So if your subject only involves practicing to fluency, don't worry about generative learning. Don't try and force it in. But the aspects of your subject where you do want them to build a new understanding, then you need them to generate learning. So you'd be using those strategies in the same way, I would have thought.
And I think sometimes performance subjects where you can see the learning. So, if I was an art teacher, I mean, I have been into schools where they do a bit of sort of knowledge retrieval because they're trying to do a kind of art history kind of backdrop and so on. But if I want to know if someone can, remember the techniques, they're just going to go and show me, aren't they? It's just more natural. You're going to go and do it. And then but you don't need to, it's like, do I know the history or geography? You can't just do it. You have to generate it. So it's more evident there, but it's just that you have to sort of construct it. Or I think some other subjects have it more built in because it's more visible, and the products that you're dealing with are the manifestation of the learning. It's easier to see. But these are the things to explore. These are really important questions. It pains me to see whole school approaches to things where you think, yeah, but you're forcing something in where it doesn't belong. So I have seen, like I want my students to, for example, with PE lessons where students are having to do sort of like knowledge retrieval when they've barely got enough time, and you think, what's the most important use of the time they've got is to kind of get out there and get fit and do sport and understand that, but in the context of doing it, not to sit in the changing room being quilled on their muscle groups. And that's my view. I mean, that's a prejudice, obviously, but it feels that it's come from a kind of whole school mandatory approach rather than the PE teachers thinking, this is what I need my students to know more about. You know what I mean? And if they were the ones that chose it, I'd be thinking, well, that's your choice. But I've been in situations where it definitely wasn't their choice.
Yeah.
And it was felt like, oh, we've got to do this quizzing thing because, the very keen assistant head teacher has made us do it. Anyway, so this is good. And I really love it. I'm going to say it again. There's not enough talk about boundary conditions in the whole research education space. So we get sort of polarization of opinion. And one of the boundary conditions you put in there was about kind of essentially the last one, enacting, sort of 2 to 7. And last week I was doing a curriculum masterclass, hosting one, and Deborah Kidd was talking about embodied cognition in sort of in the upper primary, I'd say, where she'd the way she described it, I did actually think, I really get that the way that was done would make you really understand that text way more through the kind of some aspect of enacting than you would just get from reading it. And I was persuaded by her case there. So I'm interested in that boundary condition you've put there, whether that comes from a study or just your own sense of it.
Yes, for a whole different range of studies looking at what point it becomes useful and at what point it doesn't. So the issue tends to be, as I say, once it starts to become a distraction, when you no longer need it, when you can just understand the text, you don't want to be thinking about something else, because that's just going to overwhelm your working memory, or it's going to be something else you're paying attention to, and it stops you learning the thing that we actually want them to learn. And it's a difficult judgment call. There's no absolute. At that point, it cuts off. So the same, when I use it in geography, 17 years of experience tells me they confuse those two terms, and this might be useful for them to have some kind of gesture alongside it. But it's not something that I knew on day one. You know, it comes with time. You go, okay, they need that, they don't need that. And until you try and give it a go, you don't know.
But it is really nuanced, isn't it? You have to make that call. And if we're being properly adaptive and reflective in our practice, then we will be kind of thinking, well, which students might need that? Who needs that extra opportunity? And we do it all the time when we model as well, don't we? You know, we make the call, you know, are we going to model the start of this paragraph? Or are we going to model how to get through this problem? But often we will kind of see where or we'll know where the students might fall over with that, or might have a difficulty with that, or we adapt on the hoof because we've seen that all of a sudden they can't make that kind of concrete element.
Yeah. I mean, and there are lots of examples. I mean, there's a classic one for science teachers to get students to, pretend, to be a solid, a liquid, and a gas, and that kind of thing, or throwing the convection, conduction, and radiation, or throwing the something to show that or all those sorts of things. And I think a lot of teachers do that because it's sort of visualizing particle behaviors is beyond our powers of imagining at the real scale it is. So everyone has a model which is a false model because we can't get to the real one. So you kind of have this sort of need to try to bring it alive, and some enactment. I mean, you could debate whether you could test whether it leads to better test scores later, but it is that kind of model you're forming in your head to some extent it's only testable to a degree. Anyway, these are all interesting things. MFL. So there's quite a few MFL teachers on the call on the session. How do you see which of these strategies or generative learning in MFL? What's your sort of sense of where that applies?
MFL's weird. Sorry, MFL teachers. You're lovely, but it's weird.
I do try and stop him.
It's a very unusual subject, and often when we kind of talk about whole school approaches, something very different is needed for MFL, because often this is what I was saying before about if you're just practicing to fluency, then you don't need generative learning because you're not trying to generate learning. So there would be a case where you're going to use self-testing. Where you want them to check that they've actually understood something and can do something, where they're going to be quizzing themselves on language. I can see using self-testing quite a bit. I can't see things like self-explaining unless you're looking at things like grammar, perhaps. So, why am I using this particular verb formation or whatever it is you talk about in language?
I suppose, from a language point of view, the possibility of going from kind of individual words and then that kind of vocabulary approach to actually then constructing a text, you might want to use things a bit more generatively in order to allow that to happen. And I wonder, and again, this might be, thanks. I wonder if this might be in relation to enacting as well. And I haven't got the answer to this, but maybe there is some mileage with the enacting elements with MFL. Maybe there are things that can be done for that particularly tricky concept to stick with students, which isn't just getting through kind of fluency practice. And maybe that's an approach.
Yeah, I think I've seen it done well. Well, I would say definitely it was being used. So if you look at the SOI model, so for example, you've learnt some material, some phrases and some grammar structures, but then when you're in a conversation, essentially, a book shut, you're selecting things to say, and you'll have to organize them into structures which are conversational and responsive, and then you have to sort of you consolidate that into an increased level of understanding fluency, call and response. So it's like a different way of thinking of it. But one of the things I would say is a common error in MFL is assuming students can't and won't be able to say things without the supports. And so teachers are so worried about confidence building. The students are presented with the scaffolds all the time. Now, we could talk about whether this is scaffolding, but that kind of book shut. And one of the schools I used to work in, and it was a selective school, so the teachers, I would say, had more confidence in this, but they would do a lot of book shut and then have a go at busking it with your partner and seeing if you can have the conversation. And the students were there going, blah, 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 blah. And it got to the point where they were, say, by year 9, like sort of not like doing sort of German banter in the corridor, because it became part of the thing that, can I say the funny thing in German because I can? And it wasn't through just pure repetition. It was through generative thinking about things to say. So I do think it definitely applies, but it does require a kind of confidence that the students can close their book, have a go, and then revisit. And I would see that as sort of self-testing, or all kinds of aspects of it actually, I think, apply. But, you know, this is the conversation. So when you're a non-specialist, and I'm not a specialist MFL teacher, but I have seen a lot of it, you have to think, okay, what's the connection? And those boundary conditions come in.
I think there's some lovely points coming. You know, we've got enacting words in German, and I think that looks like a positive thing. So again, I'd be really interested to see how people play around with these things, how people put it into their classroom. And you know, one of the big things since the book came out on Twitter was me saying to people, show me what you're doing. I love seeing what people are doing with this, and then having that extra layer of dialogue, building my schema around how this will work and what people are doing.
So here's an example. Someone saying, we get our students to design a heart, then they walk through the pathway. Would this be deemed as generative learning, or is this just making a theory concept become practical?
I'm trying to see how it would be generative, because if you're kind of getting them to design, I suppose it's almost like drawing as a technique, but they're just choosing to draw it themselves by walking it through. It's the collaborative nature that's quite tricky. I would suggest the person who's organizing everyone into where to stand is maybe going through some generative learning. The person who's saying, you stand here, I'll stand here, is having to think, how do I turn this model of a heart that I can see into another form, is having to go through a generative process. So it seems like essentially the drawing technique, they're just standing rather than drawing it out.
And I think that's the point there, isn't it? It's the who's doing that level of thinking. And that's where these discussions and debates need to kind of come into, and the purpose.
I think that's more about sort of explaining. That's more like a kind of explanatory thing, visualizing what's happening, but it's not at that stage generative, because you haven't got it in your memory. You know, later, if you then said, like, do that through a drawing activity, having done it in the gym, like, can you now draw a heart with a basic flow, because you're now having to show that you've understood it? That would be, but at that initial stage, it isn't, because they still don't, they're just encountering that. So, I mean, I think these things will, I'm going to conclude, because this comes up in some of my work, is what's the difference between generative learning and retrieval practice as a general concept? You know, if they had a Venn diagram or something, does one sit in the other? Or, you know, because those are sort of phrases you hear, you know, is one a form of the other? You know,
I think it was your point about your case study in particular. That's the kind of the difference with pure retrieval and generative retrieval, I suppose. We can use
I mean, you can use retrieval practice generatively, because you're having to select from what you know, organize it and integrate it. But generative learning goes a bit further than that and includes things which aren't retrieval. So for instance, you know, we said when summarizing, you might be better summarizing from memory, because that way you're building in some retrieval as well. But you can summarize with a text in front of you, selecting information, organizing it, integrating it with the text there, without actually really using retrieval at all. So retrieval might be an aspect of generative learning, and I think it's something that can help with generative learning, but it doesn't have to be there. You don't have to use retrieval in generative learning.
I think that's quite significant, because I think in my head I've kind of assumed that retrieval was a sort of, you know, that generative thing of having to sort of retrieve, but actually the way you explain it with the SOI model does make you realize that you can generatively sort of process stuff which is presented to you. And hopefully that the integration does mean that later you would be able to retrieve it more successfully.
That's the idea.
Well, there we go. Okay, I'm going to finish on that. I'm sure there are some other questions, but I was going to stop there. And for people who are dialing in to watch this later, which is most people, I'm going to say thank you very much to you for watching, and just finish by saying thank you and congratulations to Zoe and Mark for this wonderful book. It really is really good, and I recommend you should have it in every school, really, because it's, if not every pigeonhole. But thank you to both of you.
You're welcome,
Thank
Tom.
you.
It's been lovely. Thank you.